6:04. Let's have a roll call, please.
Chairman Vincent.
Here.
Jeff Maturo.
Here.
Carolyn Gallagher. Here. Rex Sims.
Here.
Linda Schwartz.
Here.
Meg Jacobson. Here. John Colapetro.
He's excused. Okay. Before we get started here into the review of these ordinances here, let me say that for the record here, again, we're looking at some things that will greatly impact the development of the urban core in downtown. These ordinances will take a look at that. They're being proposed, and this is not something that a hood and a wink that you look at and you approve or disapprove. Please consider everything that we're going to talk about and that the city will present to us, the staff, about these ordinances. This is very, very important for our downtown. We spent a lot of money in putting the improvements to downtown. We're inviting people to come into the city here to build. So be careful of what you consider for this, thinking about the future of this city. And that, for me, that's what this is all about, is the future of the city and what we're to look at. It's a vision. We had this come up, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, where we talked about on a particular project that we had here. It had to do with vision and how we up here don't control that vision, but we have something that we want to look at and make sure that it meets with the words of our comprehensive plan. So, like I said, this is not a hood and a wink. This is something to really be taken seriously. So with that, let's have Audrey read the first one into the record.
Well, before I read the title in, let me explain these 3 ordinances, and then it also kind of explain what's coming down the pipeline, or what I expect to come down the pipeline. First of all, before I even explain all these ordinances, I also want to point out, because Ms. Jacobson wasn't aware of it, I am retiring. I'm separating from the city in September. Will be my last, and I don't think we have any ordinances or anything set up for the month of September. So this will probably be my last meeting with you guys. I enjoyed working with the LPA.
We're going to miss you.
immensely.
Yeah, don't smile too hard, Audrey.
I know. And I am looking towards, my husband and I are talking about doing a sabbatical where we travel and do some other stuff. Rex and I had that conversation, do it while we're young and do kind of every bucket list type place and get, not that I won't travel when I'm older, but, get it while I'm younger also, because there is some benefit to that. I also wanted just to pull up my computer, so if I seem like I'm stalling for a second. So we have 3 ordinances, and the 3 ordinances have one thing in common, and they were considered quick fix things with our land development code after a joint meeting between the zoning board and city council. Zoning board would be your brethren in the sense that the local planning agency looks at issues, and remember, I've always explained, you guys are statutorily created. You look at our comprehensive plan, as Chairman Vincent just explained very well. You look at our comprehensive plan, and with that, there's oversight of our land development regulations. The zoning board's function is to handle the zoning cases. So sometimes in some communities they call it short-term planning or immediate planning, because they're the ones who are going to do the very short things and then the long term. Well, they had a joint meeting, the city council and the zoning board, in April, and they discussed some quick fixes. And so the 3 ordinances we have here today are quick fixes. Now, in the long-term fixes, there are some additional changes, and one of them, which I cite to in a whereas clause, is rewriting the entire Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. As you know, we were an unincorporated area until 2000, became a city, and we adopted our comprehensive plan statutorily within the 2 years. I believe you're supposed to have it adopted. We did have a land development code created that had some issues that we were never able to finalize, and that was something you worked on. So we've had the Lee County Code just with, Jackie and I actually made those changes in 2011, with the names changed, and taking out anything that clearly didn't apply to us. Obviously, provisions related to Pine Island have no bearing here. Taking out only that and just literally changing some names. So we've done some little changes. We've done, of course, work in the old 41, and we've done some overlays. Now they're talking about doing things like melding the two. So you're going to probably see those in a series of meetings once they get a little farther on. So now with that in mind, let me read the 3 title blocks. The first is, and I'll read all 3 title blocks together. An amendment to Bonita Springs Land Development Code 4 zoning, amending section 4-326, deviations from general zoning regulations, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and effective date. The second ordinance is an amendment to the Bonita Springs Land Development Code 4, creating section 4-371, allocation of density and intensity for mixed-use development, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and an effective date. And the third and last one is an amendment to the Bonita Springs Land Development Code 4, zoning, creating section 4-28, neighborhood meetings, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and an effective date. So the first ordinance, which I want you to consider, is the deviation from general zoning regulations. So in this particular ordinance, we're modifying an existing provision. Currently, deviations are permitted in planned developments as long as you're showing what's being demonstrated, it's not to the detriment of the public interest. So that's not a very high standard of review. Instead, the applicant will now have to show there is a public benefit for each requested deviation. And there's some examples in there as to the types of public benefits. And also making very clear, nobody has a entitlement to a deviation. I think a deviation is very similar to a variance. The standard of review, however, is a much lower hurdle. So people do request, they actually go for planned developments for that purpose. And this is just to make it a little tighter and make it so that people actually provide a benefit to the public when city council is using those powers. Jackie?
And this was some feedback that we have received from the zoning board in their review of current plan development rezoning requests, is they wanted to go ahead and make those modifications pertaining to the public interest and detriment. So we revised that section. But also, again, with the deviations, the council and the zoning board felt that, you know, if you're requesting a departure from the land development code, then the city in turn should be getting some type of benefit. And that's where the public benefit component was recommended to be added to this ordinance. So that's some additional background on why the code is written the way it is before you.
Any chance you can give us an example of what a public benefit would be? What you would expect?
So for an example, if someone was asking for a deviation for a landscape buffer requirement, and in return for giving them some relief in that code, they would provide an enhanced buffer. So maybe larger trees, larger shrubs, if we gave them relief on the width of the buffer. So, and we're trying to tie the benefit so that it is relative to the deviation that's being requested. So something like that. We don't really have any concrete examples because deviations are so unique in themselves and they're uniquely tied to the property. But that would be an example.
Yeah, that's perfect.
What we want to be careful is what we call exactions, because exactions can be unlawful if there's no reasonable connection to the property. In this case, hopefully, you would have a reasonable connection if it is a public benefit tied to getting the grant, of having a change. There is that connection there, so you can find that nexus so that you wouldn't say it's an unlawful exaction. as to whether or not it would actually, I would anticipate that would be the concern the development community may argue. I think as long as you're able to show a very solid nexus between the two, it shouldn't be a problem. That's how it's applied, not how it's written. So that would be the fear, after I'm gone. Well, why do we have this provision in here? I think it's lawfully drafted. It's how, the actual decision makers apply it is always a concern, but that's a policy call.
Let me ask a question here. Why would, illustrating how each deviation would operate to the benefit, or at least not to the detriment of the public interest, why is it stricken?
Because that's a low standard. That is the current standard. And so the new standard would be providing how everything is being enhanced if it is granted, and that's where you now are providing a public benefit. So the lower standard language you want to take out because that would not provide you that benefit.
I have a concern here with all these requirements here and deviations. And then you use the words quick fix. Quick fix anything is of concern to me.
So I did not come up with that term. So I'm not going to take credit for it, neither did Ms. Genson.
Where did that come from?
It's just for an accelerated time frame to go ahead and make this change because we have pending rezoning applications that are under review, and we want to be able to hold them to this standard.
Right.
So
it's an
the,
expedited.
The
Right,
ten-
outside counsel made the term, the outside counsel rightfully reviewed the land development code and said, here's where I see long-term horizon things, here's where you have some very quick fixes, short-term, easy to remedy. Now, originally I was going to have this drafted as one ordinance with the modifications, and the concern was if one or more of the issues, there was another quick fix that was accompanying these ordinances, and it was taken out when it was permission to advertise. So it works, I think this is a case where it works better to have each of these as because they are separate subjects, very short ordinances. That's where the term quick fix came.
well, the city has been working, I know that community development has been working with deviations and how you handle those on separate cases. And usually there is a benefit for each. If a benefit is given to a developer, then the city gets a benefit in return. Why is that not working?
That is working if that's a practical application, but the language, as it currently reads, would say the standard that Ms. Genson should be reviewing this is, hey, it's not causing a detriment, so you should be giving it to me. So this makes it a little harder for people. They need to actually provide justification to her rather than she having to justify that it's not creating a detriment. It shifts the burden.
Correct, and I think too, it's the city council and the zoning board wanting a higher quality return if we're going to depart from our code. So for an applicant to say, well, you know what, the deviation I'm asking for, I'm not really hurting the public, so you can just give it to me. And I don't think that was acceptable to them. So this language right here provides us a little more, like Audrey said, a higher standard of review, and the viewpoint that we are really getting a benefit for the deviation that they're seeking.
I had a question too. You deliberately took out the intent of the regulations to protect health, safety, and welfare. I'm just curious why you did that, why you wouldn't, reword it, but you put something like that back in. I don't equate a benefit to the city as necessarily keeping the health safety, or serving the health, safety, and welfare. Are you following me? Like you talk about bigger trees and so on, that has nothing to do with health, safety, and welfare. That's fine, but it's a totally different thing. I guess what I'm saying is that you could have a deviation that seems to be better, but there could be a darker side where it could do, I'm not saying this very well.
So I think what
Yeah,
you're saying,
okay.
you would like to retain the language because it probably,
I'm thinking it might be better unless it is elsewhere in here somewhere, in the,
It could be left in, I mean, we could put it back in.
you can't put it in exactly like it is.
I think it was taken out for wordiness,
Yes.
because everything that council and the zoning board should be doing is to protect the health, safety, and welfare whenever they make any decision. So, I mean, in a way, it might be redundant with the normal standard, and I think, I was not the drafter of this document. I think we can leave it back in if the LPA wants that. I think that was taken out mostly for wordiness.
Yeah, maybe you can find something that's a little more
I have a question.
brief. Yeah.
Are you done?
Yes.
I have a
For
question. I'm a little confused about how the trade-off is going to come here. For example, could I increase a landscaping or buffer and get on-street parking?
that could be viewed as a benefit. However, without a specific example, I
Well,
can't tell
we've
you
done that down on Dean Street. We've got on-street parking as part of the parking requirements for that apartment complex. So I'm looking at this and saying, well, gee, why don't I just put some more buffering in the back here, and I can transfer my on-site parking to the street, and I can get something else in there.
Well, and you could probably do something, probably more with street trees, street furniture, something where the public would then have the right to be able to.
All right.
To relax.
So let's talk, I think the thing that's troubling everybody here is the lack of being specific. I think this is, you're approached a problem that's obviously a problem, but I think you're approaching it with a pretty broad brush. And this bothers me a great deal because of the lack of specific content. And for example, could this also be a trade-off for density, like the kayak launch?
The density provision, so again, the reason why this is so broad in general is an applicant can ask for a deviation during the plan development rezoning process from almost any chapter. So to go ahead and specify and address every situation is virtually impossible because each project's going to be unique in its own right. For density purposes, it's going to depend where we are within the city because we have bonus density for on-site affordable housing or cash contribution. And in terms of that, there's a whole set of regulations in land development code in terms of how that's
But this could lead to
administered.
that.
Yeah.
This,
I don't think it might be tied to as an additional benefit for why council should consider providing bonus density, but in downtown, the comprehensive plan policy for downtown specifies what types of improvements would be eligible for council to award bonus density. So I think that is a separate process.
but
Because
we're
for
not
downtown,
sure.
it's,
I look at it and I think this is an avenue that could be pursued for somebody seeking additional density. We agreed to do 2 or 3 of these things in our project for a bonus. And then the other thing that bothers me about once this is granted, I don't know how the follow-up on it is enforced. If the shrubbery dies and we don't replace it, like up at CVS on Beach Road, nobody cares.
well, that's a landscape compliance issue. We
Yeah.
do have regulations in our
Okay,
code
but
in
if we're
terms of
saying,
maintenance.
okay, I'm getting something for doing additional landscaping, and then in a couple of years the landscaping is dead, then I've gotten a bonus for nothing.
Well, and that's shame on the city if they're not using
Well,
their enforcement
The
powers to
city's a
get
big city,
compliance.
and it's getting bigger and those
Right.
things, but I look at those things, I think, we're giving away something and for something that we're not really, at least I'm not determined that it's specific. And
But-
I've nothing wrong with speeding up the process, although I think what we have has worked fairly well for the past 16 years. But I think if we're going to change it, then let's not just make it easier, let's make it specific.
Well, and understand that this change, we've always been in a situation where council had the authority to grant deviations for plan developments. We're changing the standard of review for that granting of that authority. So it's not, this is not a change where deviations are a brand-new thing and we're allowing it. This is a change where we're taking the deviations that council has always been allowed to do so, and we're making the applicant actually justify why the public gets a benefit from this deviation, rather than have staff or council, because sometimes if staff's in agreement with the deviation, I've had to be there at council meetings where I said, I need to write a resolution denying a project, and you're telling me you have a problem with the deviations, can you explain why? And it puts a burden on council to actually explain that. And so this change is now saying, well, the applicant's request is not sufficient enough, allows council, to make those decisions, which of course courts have to defer to the council decision.
Let me ask a different kind of question. How does rewriting this benefit community development in your reviews?
The new language about the public benefit, I think, is a very good precedent to start. I agree with the zoning board and council's thought process on that. I think it, again, provides a higher standard of review when we evaluate these requests and makes deviations that much more beneficial in our review and whether or not we recommend approval or denial of those. So I think the public benefit component is very important and is a great idea. And so outside counsel, David Theriak, helped us with drafting these regulations, and he has seen some of the same language in other jurisdictions and has brought that to our attention as a good item to go ahead and add. And I will note in this document, unfortunately, there is a new sentence and it's not underlined, where it says, when determined to be appropriate by city council, one public benefit may justify the granting of more than one. And Rex, that might address where you were coming from. If they're asking for a deviation for something else, can they use the same benefit to achieve another deviation? And we added that language to address that situation where it could give council the flexibility to evaluate that, because there might be a public benefit that is truly surmountable to being attributed to multiple deviation requests. It's just going to be a case-by-case basis, so we wanted to build in that flexibility. So that language should be underlined.
Okay,
I
thank you for
apologize for
letting
that.
me
Going back to what Rex said, could you put something in that if you allow the deviation and they do some kind of something for the city to make it better, that you put a requirement that they maintain it for what is the word, posterity, or
I think we have that covered right now.
Right, the
Or
codes
do
do
you?
have it, because if it's on private property, we have the property maintenance code, we have in our chapter 3 section, the maintenance responsibility for landscaping, so I believe our codes already,
so if they
cover.
decide to dig out the hedge or something and put in something else,
they
they
would be
could
in
do
violation of their zoning ordinance, and code enforcement would have every right to seek action
Or
for
they'd have to
corrective
obtain an
measures.
administrative amendment. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and they would need to obtain an administrative amendment unless you couldn't give an administrative amendment because it was outside your authority. It'd have to go as an amendment to a zoning case.
So the plan development rezoning process for which the deviations are sought ultimately end up in what we call a zoning ordinance that is tied to a specific piece of property. and that ordinance governs development on that property. So when they file for their site permitting, their vertical construction, they still have to be consistent with that specific zoning ordinance. So if they're out of compliance with that zoning ordinance, which would have included the deviations, and the conditions for us to approve those deviations, if they're not in compliance, then the city's neighborhood services does have enforcement powers under that ordinance to get corrective measure.
Let me ask, if we were to put ourselves in the developer's shoes, how does this benefit the developer? Meaning that could be someone wanting to build something small on a lot downtown. How would it benefit them by making these changes?
So a recent example, which is pending before the city council and will be scheduled for their next meeting on Wednesday, is so we have a project downtown, the Terry Street project, which this board went ahead and reviewed their companion comprehensive plan amendment. They asked for some relief in the siting of their buildings, and that was to accommodate a civic piece, a linear park within their development. So the development community, on my behalf, I have reached out to the planning consultants and the zoning consultants in our area to let them know about some of these changes because it would affect their projects. We've had one or two participate, but it was on another ordinance, not this specific one. So I haven't gotten any negative feedback in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
Okay,
And I
thank you.
put them also on notice on any of our pending applications too about these changes. And I
A
haven't
few
heard
years
anything.
ago, we had the storage rental building up here on Beach Road, and they asked for a deviation to park. It seems to me, help me, it seems to me they asked for a deviation in setback or something to park rental trucks there. And they were going to shield it with landscaping. And then later on, there was this big controversy about the trucks were in there, as I recall, or the trailers, whatever it was. But there was a controversy about the landscaping that they put in. And it drug on for a while, but ultimately they obviously fixed it. But the problem, as I see it, is once that's granted, I really don't understand how, once a person achieves the benefits from it, how is it enforced? It's just
Yeah.
hanging out there, kind of. I don't know. I think that I'm in favor of what we're doing here, helping in any way we can the citizens of the community. But I think that this is not specific enough to satisfy me.
You know, I was just reading through this and looking at the examples, and it's, of course, not limited to this. And of course, I guess, as always, the council has the ability to decide what's equitable. And that's really the whole key here is what is equitable. I'm giving you this, you're giving me that. What's the value of this against that? And who determines that? Well, we've allowed the council to make that determination. And I guess what I'm after here is if we go down that route, it's going to say a lot about this city and whether or not people want to invest in this city when things are not equitable. I don't want to put my money here, our banks don't want to put their money here because things are not equitable. How do we make sure that they are equitable when we give these giveaways and these trades that we make? Is there language that protects the people who want to invest here from this thing being one-sided?
What I can tell you is the process for the deviations, when we review them at time of application, the applicant's agent submits an exhibit that explains what deviation they're seeking, and then they are to justify why it should be approved based on the standards set out forth in this
Right.
ordinance. And then staff reviews those and whether or not we are in agreement, or if we want to deny, or if we want to agree with modification. Staff has that recommendation authority. And then once the project is scheduled for public hearing, we then present it to the zoning board. And if they agree with the staff or the applicant, then they make their recommendation and ultimately for city council. I do understand how there could be some concern about subjectivity, but I think some of that already exists today with how the code's written right now.
Even if it wasn't a code issue, cities are an evolution. I mean, what people would have done in 1920
Right.
as opposed to 1950, as opposed to 1970, as opposed to today, it's, radically different in what we look at and what we find necessary. And you have people who have the property rights that might have emanated from 1920, 1930, and haven't touched their property since then. And we do have some of that in Bonita Springs. And then you have people who constantly change it, and I'm looking at the storage one, there's about 8 different deviations, which some councils, 8 deviations would be, yes, we had a nip and cut to make this project work and make it make sense. And then other councils, 2 deviations would be too many. That if an applicant has, it's almost like a weight thing, as opposed to the actual review and justification. Just seeing the deviations will put hair, raise the hair on their back. And that's perfectly fine. That's each community, you'll get a point where you have a lot of zoning cases, then you drop to almost no zoning cases, and that's how the community evolves.
Does this involve the overlay districts also?
Yes, but
Particularly.
there's other benefits in the overlay district that it's unlikely that they're gonna need a deviation.
But they were put there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
When we designed the overlay districts, the things that we put in there to achieve a certain benefit for the overlay district.
And-
And so I'm looking at this, would this supersede the overlay district?
So again, the only time that a deviation would be requested is during a plan development and rezoning process. So if there's a project in the overlay that does not meet the overlay standard or codes, they either have the choice to seek a variance, or if they need to seek a plan development rezoning process, that's within their purview. But depending on what they need to vary from or deviate from, maybe that's an issue with the code. I know with downtown, that's a whole other subject. But as we get more urban and we're transitioning from a suburban code, it's a totally different set of standards. But in terms of downtown, it just depends. These deviations would only occur when you're seeking a plan development rezoning. Otherwise, there's the variance process, which is a whole nother standard of review.
But this is, like you were saying, this doesn't specify, because this says deviations from general zoning regulations. So you would assume that it would cover the overlays, or maybe
It
you
could.
wouldn't.
It
No,
could.
it does. People
I think
ask
that needs
for
to be
deviations from.
To kind of be made,
It only
Clear.
occurs when someone requests a plan development rezoning. So if you happen to be in the old 41 overlay and you're going through a rezoning process to a plan development, if you need to seek any type of departure from the code, they can request a deviation. If you're in the new 41 overlay, same standards apply. If you need to deviate from chapter 4 or chapter 3 when it's not a technical deviation, this would be a vehicle to go ahead and pursue those.
I think that, up till now, I think, I've been here doing my job as city architect for 12, 13 years, and community development has done a great job, I think, in making these things equitable for the builder and the developer. As professionals, they have a good insight to that sort of thing. And I guess this probably is worded very well, and I think what you're looking at, Jackie, is how do we take this thing out of the realm of being subjective for me to make a decision about what's equitable and what kinds of benefits are for the city. And I understand that, and I think that's wise. It needs to be in writing, what you can and can't do. And I think that this would give you a little bit of help in making that determination. Is that correct?
I just think we can't evaluate what's equitable until we know what they're deviating from. And that's what it's just, and that's even under the code as it's written today for deviations, for us to evaluate under the current standards, until we know what they're deviating from and their justification for doing so, you still don't know if your evaluation under the criteria is subjective until you know what they're requesting.
But nevertheless, this does give you a helping hand in making those determinations.
I think this enhances the deviation process to ensure that we're getting a public benefit. I think that
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
But ultimately, whether you make how would you say, decision that what's good for the city, you do that first. Then the council has a decision to make whether or not they agree with that. That's kind of the way the process works on these planned developments. So I don't right now, I guess, see a problem with sort of tightening this thing up on here. I think the next two will delve more into that. This seems benign, and that's the reason I asked for the benefit to the developers, because my concern here is how we grow as a city and how, when we do that, how we comply with the vision that happened back in when we started as a city, and you know, what this board did in getting that vision into a plan. And that was broad. It was generally stated. Now we're getting down to the very specifics here. And my question is, do things like this change that vision? Was that a immature vision? Is this a better vision for a city? And how we make these trade-offs? And I don't know necessarily if it relies on 7 people of the council to decide that. According to the laws, it does. However, I view community development as a very professional group of people that understand planning, zoning, and those kinds of things. So, you know, I rely upon them, and so far they've done a great job with that. It's kind of going in circles here, but whatever the board here decides.
Yeah, this is tough, and I have another, just a comment. I'm going back to Rex's example of the business that wanted to park trucks and plant a facade of some sort of hedges or something in front of it. Would that meet these standards? Because in my mind, you get oh, well, you're enhancing the property with all these beautiful trees. On the other hand, I don't think that
So,
you know, it's to do that to allow him to park trucks, which is something that you wouldn't want.
Rex, are we talking about the self-storage facility on Bonita Beach Road in Imperial?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, if I remember correctly, because I processed the amendment, not the initial zoning, they wanted to have an outdoor storage component, and they were within 125 feet of a single-family residential neighborhood. So our code requires, when that happens, they have to erect a buffer with a wall 25 feet off their property line, and then have some substantial plantings. In this case, I think they wanted to forego the wall, and they offered an enhanced landscape buffer to act as headlight glare, things like that. I don't recall what their justification was, but in that case, they would have to demonstrate how is it a public benefit that the city should forego the wall and put in more landscaping. So that would be an example of
I think that's kind of my question.
work.
It seems like you're giving, in that case, giving them all the benefit with very little benefit to the city.
And there lies why
So-
the city council and the zoning board thinks that this is so important.
Well,
I think the thing
so-
that you're struggling with, and that I'm struggling with a little bit, is that these decisions are going to be made by a group of, the council essentially, is going to determine architectural features. And beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So what may be a beautiful architectural feature to me may not be to you. So I look at this and I think, I like the idea, and I'm
Yeah.
perfectly willing, but I'm bothered by the lack of specifics in it. There's too much architectural features. Well, what architectural features? what constitutes architectural features? What constitutes beautification in the public realm? Do I paint the building green? That's beautiful to some people, but does that something that qualifies?
Doesn't that go back to what you were saying, that you can't determine that until you know what
It's being
the
requested.
deviation, right?
I-
It goes back to
I
what
feel a lack
Sam was saying too,
of-
about they just make the decision.
Yeah,
The-
somebody else, we're creating a process here where a group of people can make decisions that are going to last for 50 years in this
Right.
community and take it away from what to me is the printed instructions, and it's going to be determined by a group of people that may or may not have the same interest in mind.
Let me ask you this, it's reading between some of the lines, there seems to be some concern that enforcement will that the city will have no teeth to enforce anything that is already in place right now. So say if this was granted, they didn't comply, there is something in place that would force them to comply.
Yes, there are codes in place, existing codes in place to do enforcement. And we can come back on another day and explain, the enforcement process. Now, can it be better? Of course. We could have more staff and more people looking to, a good example, I think where Ms. Schwartz lives, there was stormwater issues. So, there could be better enforcement.
Well, Rex, you do have a city
Actually, where Ms.
architect.
Gallagher lives too.
Pardon?
You do have a city architect.
Yes. Yes, you're doing a good one.
And if I may, just to give you a little more background, initially we always contemplated adding the public benefit language, and then I just recommended adding the language about the example so it could provide some guidance on what we meant
Right.
as a public benefit. And for that I looked to other jurisdictions to see what they had in their codes, and this example I modified after Collier County, where they actually kind of said, well, these are some of the examples of like for like when you evaluate these deviation requests, what they could be.
Right.
So that's why it's not limited to, but it just gives someone some insight into what the regulation is intended for.
Are there any deviations that would never even be considered favorably by the city?
Yeah, there could be. I've recommended denial of deviations before.
And usually they'll withdraw deviations before the hearing. So there'll be a request, and the request may have 10 deviations, and some of them will not fly whatsoever. I mean, it would, the type that you just look at it and you say, you've got to be nuts. There's no way.
Are there any of those that could be written into this code, like we would never approve this, or that, maybe I'm getting into too
That
many
might be too
weeds
much.
here,
And,
but-
and let me, it's interesting because, like I said, I did not draft this ordinance. When I go into Muni Code, and incidentally, deviation is not a word used in the comprehensive plan, so we don't even have that term as a comp plan issue. But in the Land Development Code, we use it 50 times, or 50 different provisions. Use the language deviations. So we do have other deviation, and so when originally drafting, I was gonna put it in a different location. We have different procedures in place. This was the area where they felt it would be the most easiest to make the amendment, and it would apply to all the remaining areas. So we have procedures for approval. We have language, what is a deviation versus what is a variance. And we have, huh?
It's only for plan development.
Right, it's only for PDs. Where staff has the ability to do administrative deviations, because not everything goes to public hearing. There is sometimes where staff makes that call if it's within their limited authority, and they do have. We have, there's already, for Mr. Maturo, there's already the requirement that any deviation from plans that where they failed to continue having it does have enforcement capability. So there's also areas of the code where we do not allow variances or deviations. For example, height, especially on Little Hickory Island. Height is a very big issue, a tall issue, I guess, for the height issue. And so we don't even allow deviations to be considered. So no matter what public benefit, that's self-stripped of council as well as staff from doing things. So that's already in our code. This is just a modification to tweak. Now, the term that was used at the workshop was quid pro quo, because basically it was explained from outside counsel that, hey, and you don't require the developer to actually provide a benefit. You just say they just can't cause more harm by giving that deviation. This is a very low standard, and other communities have a much higher standard. So providing a public benefit language, so that they have a document, this shifts that burden of proof to the developer on why it should fit in. And as we get more to a built-out community as opposed to a suburban community, which is where we started from, you need to know that information because you have more public. It's not like some development that's out there by itself.
Would someone like to make any more comments or?
No, I have no comment. I'm comfortable with this. I think I've heard enough that, I think this would work, and I trust the planning staff to be able to make those judgments.
I second what I take as a motion to accept the ordinance as it stands.
Yes, I've seen community development in action, and really there is somewhere in here you have to take a leap of faith of who is protecting, the comprehensive plan, because the comprehensive plan is what made us a city, because there is where your dreams and your what you want to be is written. But I feel comfortable with the decisions I've seen so far. Is anyone want to make a motion, as a motion?
I will make a motion to approve.
And I'll second the motion.
As motion and second, is there any other discussions? Okay, let's take a vote.
Chairman Vincent,
Aye.
Jeff Maturo,
Aye.
Carolyn Gallagher,
Aye.
Rex Sims,
No.
Linda Schwartz,
Aye.
Meg Jacobson.
Aye.
And I just want to say, this ordinance will be scheduled for its second public hearing on September 5th, beginning at 5 p.m. at City Council chambers, as well as the other ordinances. Let's go to the next ordinance. You ready? And again, I read the title block into the record. This one is creating a whole new provision in the Land Development Code. I read the title block, so Force 371, allocation of density intensity for mixed-use development. This is one I believe staff had initially requested to avoid calculation issues. Jackie?
At the joint city council workshop, and even prior to that, there has been concern with some of the recent mixed-use plan developments that aren't necessarily vertically mixed use. They're what I would call horizontal mixed use. And when those occur, those applications were using the density for the entire project area to calculate all the residential units and clustering them on one side, but then allowing them to also utilize the floor area ratio for that property as well to do the non-residential development. And that was termed the double dipping of density and intensity in mixed-use projects. So this standard here is to go ahead and set forth standards that does not allow that provision. And when we do have mixed-use projects, how they are to go ahead and calculate the density and the intensity of those uses to ensure that there is no double dipping occurring. So that's what you'll see from sections A through D, is how we go ahead and calculate those. Now, recognizing that there are some projects, most notably planned developments, that have already received their zoning entitlements, or properties that have started the site development permitting process, the city has provided essentially an exemption where this new code section would not apply. Also, we're not going to make it apply where areas in the comprehensive plan, such as the downtown overlay, allows for a limited double dipping of density and intensity. So you'll see that in number 1, there's a section already in our comprehensive plan where if you're located in a mixed-use sub-area, the city staff may exclude the first floor commercial intensity in calculating residential density for the entire project. So that's what E1 is referring to. E2 is referring to the Terry Street sub-district, which is an application that was before the board a few months ago, because that allows a double dipping of density intensity. And then items 3 through 8 recognize those projects that have already received some sort of entitlement. The council didn't believe if we had projects that were in under the current regulations that they should not have essentially the rug swept out from underneath them. So that is why 3 and 8 is listed the way they are. Are there any questions?
Yes, only question I have is, if I were building 3-story and the first floor was commercial, the second floor was, say, office, and the third floor was residential, and I built the building and I found out that I couldn't rent the office space, how would I change, or would I be able to change the second floor into residential? Because I would be exceeding my,
You're gonna make me do complicated math.
well,
Yeah,
I
I
mean, this-
understand.
these
A
are the
conversion,
things
it is
that
a
happen
real, yeah.
in real
I
life
totally
out there,
understand.
and we're in a new territory here, and so we want to look, because nobody knows right now from the buildings that are contemplated on Old 41 that there's that much office space. Maybe there is
Demand for it.
requirement, but it seems to me that's quite a bit. So I look at it and think, okay, if I had a building there and the second floor was half empty, I'd like to do something with it. But this would then prohibit me from doing that because my footprint would be beyond the density levels. Is that, am I reading that right?
So it would depend. If the project maxed out its density, I think what the mathematical exercise that we would have to go through is the calculation of the square foot into a floor area ratio and somehow having I wouldn't say a conversion, but an equitable ratio for how many dwelling units that equates to.
Well, I'm thinking there's other issues too. If the difference in the parking requirements for different office space requirements and so forth. Are we, help me, Sam, are we making it difficult for a developer to project a project that will be a financial success, which is what we
Yes.
want,
You're absolutely right.
and yet be flexible enough that,
That's right, and that's the statement I made before we approved this last ordinance had to do with just that. As I boil all this stuff down here and I look at the comp plan of what we want for this city, and we want to grow as a city. In other words, we have a downtown area that we want to utilize, and we want people to come to. Now, if we bottleneck flexibility with the developer for such things as that, then we're saying, we don't want you if you're over 1 story or 2 story. We want only feed stores downtown. And you have to be careful of that. Our downtown is underutilized, and that's why it's not been developed in the last 20, 30 years. It has had the mentality of being small, and small somehow is supposed to be great. It's supposed to be good. In some respects it is. But again, we're all getting older here. What about the young people that want vitality, and young people that want to grow and have a place to live in that is a nice place to live, but it's an active place to live where they get the kinds of enjoyment and things they like to do? That comes from intensity and density. You can't get it any other way. And so I'm wondering if these kinds of things are trying to regulate and hamstring developers who are looking for some flexibility to bring that kind of vitality to the downtown area. As I said before, and I love to use that example, we don't need any more seed stores downtown.
If I may, for downtown, we have obviously under Section E of this draft language, 1 and 2 that pertain to downtown. And what's occurring right now is the city has contracted with DPZ to do an analysis of downtown and potentially create a form-based code. And out of that exercise, they may have some recommendations on building form, and maybe some other density and intensity issues. So until that goes before the city council, I don't know what direction we're gonna go with downtown. In terms of outside of the city boundaries, outside of the downtown areas for the rest of the city, that's where some of these regulations would take place, with the double dipping of density and intensity. And I think, Rex, for your question, Jay Sweet in our office tried to address this conversion topic in our downtown. And not the challenge, but our current code, we don't have a minimum square footage requirement for a dwelling unit. And in your situation where you're asking, well, how do I take office space, which for our code purposes, we regulate intensity by floor area ratio, which is square feet. And when you have dwelling units, you do it by dwelling units per an acre. So how do you get that ratio if you want to convert? So what is the right square footage equivalent to a dwelling unit? And I think with that, that would answer your concern, because the way the code is written here in draft format is that the density allocations would be a pro rata share of the residential and non-residential. So if later down the road the market's not supporting non-residential uses and you want to convert it, if we had a standard of what that square footage could be converted to in dwelling units, I think that will address your question, and we can work on that.
We had the discussion about allowance, came up with Tony's project on
Right.
square footage for residential, and it was very small. I don't remember what it was, but it was 300 or 400 square feet. I thought that was, I thought that was very small, but, you know.
Depends on the form of living. But you're in your more urban areas, yeah.
Well, you know, what's difficult here, I think, for any developer, and Tony explained that, was markets change all the time. And so how do we help him to not only benefit the city, but allow him the flexibility to make changes as bankers require these changes for more economic benefit? How do we make these changes? And Jackie, I think you just mentioned that there, is to have some kind of a ratio that could be determined pre-hand of what he could do in case the something happened to his project where he wasn't leasing up as he should, and he wants to do something else with it.
Yeah.
You have to allow that kind of flexibility because we don't know where these markets go.
And because our land development code didn't have that standard size of square footage equivalent to a dwelling unit, he had tied it to trip generation with the Institute of Traffic Engineers manual. So that's how they got the equivalent factor for that.
But the question here, though, as you read in B here, is looking at density as being vertical, and what they're trying to do is use this horizontally. Is that a bad thing in terms of a planner?
Depends what type of development form the city is seeking.
And right now, in your opinion, where does it look like we want to head with this expanding horizontally rather than vertically?
In certain portions of the city, for example, with the Bonita Beach Road corridor, there's a land use study that is currently underway with DPZ out of Miami, where they're looking at creating or recommending nodes. And in those nodes, you would promote the vertical mixed-use development scenario. As you get outside those nodes, then you could have those single-use or more compartmentalized uses. So the city does have consultants that are evaluating those types of development patterns as we speak. And it's just a matter of time before we go ahead and continue to work with them and it gets brought back to council for guidance and direction.
So it's an issue of development patterns. rather than if you say, just look at Old 41 Road, which you can do it there as well, but you don't have as much land area to do it in, right?
Correct, and I think, again, it's, you know, in downtown, we're gonna create a different type of experience. And again, DPZ is also looking at it from that angle, but then with Bonita Beach Road, with the vision and the multimodal improvements, it's creating these nodes to go ahead and support those development patterns, to go ahead and more so create and activate that type of activity.
Yeah. I would think in the downtown area, you could probably have some nodes of verticality and others, you know, horizontally, because there's not much land. You have to buy up lots of property to make a project profitable. So that's why developers are looking at this sort of thing, right?
Well, I think the die is already cast on Old 41. We have the Felt Street Fortress over there, banged up against the sidewalk, and that kind of establishes the code for the rest of the downtown, is this 3-story monster over there on Felt Street.
The library?
Yeah, the library. I call it the Felt Street Fortress. Send down the
It's a
drawbridge.
civic anchor.
But anyhow, that kind of evidently forecasts the future of downtown Bonita to me.
Well, I think we've changed it so that we're requiring buildings to be no more than 12 feet, you know, off the street. So that was cast a while back, and I think that's where we headed, for a more urban feel for the downtown area, and that would work. And I think that I'm trying to decide though what this thing is trying to control really. And I want to be real careful with it. Is that when you limit the density and intensity, you're changing your attitude about how you're looking at a downtown. But I'm not talking about Beach Road. That is something different. I'm looking at the impacts it will have on downtown, this sort of thing. From a planning standpoint, a profitability standpoint, from the standpoint of those who want to invest in downtown 041 with projects. Does this sort of thing begin to limit the development in a positive sense for downtown in the future?
I think for downtown, the direction that has been, or sorry, the message that I've heard that has come out of the white paper is that council wants to be able to, within the downtown area, provide development regulations that are easy to understand and they're consistent. So you wouldn't have to go through a planned development rezoning request to where this would come up. So we've retained DPZ. They're going through the exercise of what they think would be appropriate redevelopment of the downtown area. And from that, hopefully we can have, what comes out of that process with their recommendations is that we make code changes. So when a developer comes in, they don't have to go through a rezoning process where this would come up. They know what their density is, they know what their intensity is, they know where the buildings have to be, they know the design that the city's looking for. It just takes out all of any ambiguity. So they want it to be predictable.
But when the market is not predictable, doesn't this hamstring a developer into having to do exactly what he proposed in the beginning?
Again, with the DPZ plan, I think some of their recommendations are going to be building form. And then with that, I mean, usually with form-based codes, they don't so much get into the minutia of density and intensity. It's more the form of the building, the build two lines, the height of the building, where they step back, and whatever you can fit in it, that's the development that occurs. But for us, with the city, I believe we want to maintain a floor area ratio and a density. And depending on the recommendations from DPZ, there may be some guidance in terms of what those densities and intensities should be.
If I may add to this, when I look at the comprehensive plan, and I'm looking at policy 1.1.2, which is density, and then later on it goes into affordable housing, but we're not going to go into that part. And I just look at subsection A, the very first principle in the comp plan and how to read the future land use element with goals, objectives, and policies is while each individual land use category, and that's in the comp plan, may include a maximum allowable density for residential uses, the actual allowable density for any given property will be stated in the land development code based on, but not necessarily limited to, consideration of the following factors. One is, the first one, of course, is compatibility with surrounding existing land uses and future land use patterns. 2, vehicular access and existing and planned roadway patterns. 3, availability of public services and facilities. And 4, environmental considerations. So different comp plans read differently. Some comprehensive plans read ranges of density. Lee County does that type of, in ours we have a maximum. And the concern is if you always allow the maximum, people, and it's kind of same as sign ordinances. People, if somebody has one big sign, then somebody needs the same big sign. It's almost, they always go that way. And density kind of has that same pattern in growth, whether it's sometimes good, sometimes bad. People are trying to gentrify and densify in certain areas. And you do need things in the land development code that provide the ability to not have these calculations that, and I tease her about being a bean counter, these calculations that can be far-fetched. I mean, because they get to a point where the development is inconsistent with the comp plan at that point. So this is trying to just provide a control measure for council so that they're, when they do the math, they can check and make sure everything fits within the allocations.
But couldn't we use the example of the last ordinance to talk about benefits for each party and with the trade-offs we make? If there is a choice to be made about, I can give you this if I get more density, which we've been doing, and you can show that you're giving something to the public to get that density or intensity. Does this, by adopting this, does it limit what I can give or what I can propose?
Well, they're still staying within their bonus density. So, I mean, the development, it's how they get to their bonus density. So some people do not want property to be labeled affordable housing because affordable housing has certain, whether it's stigma, whether it's ranges or concerns. So it provides a vehicle to have that density. And this just makes sure that people don't go into a double dip.
Yeah. Well, in here it says the maximum density shall be determined on the portion of property used for residential purposes. That's as it stands now.
Right.
If I want to rezone something that's residential now into something that is non-residential, does any of this limit the ability to do that with the idea of, the word I'm looking for here, the premise of the council, meaning that a council may not want to see development in the downtown area in any kind of way. How does this allow someone to change it from residential to non-residential and get some benefit if he wants to give something stronger back to the city, parks or what have you?
Well, at that point, they are basically creating an open space
Right.
at that location for the trade-off of having the intensity and the density.
So if they want to do that, they could by doing something like that, right?
As long as that park that they're giving us is something they own and they have the ability, so they're densifying and intensifying in one area and then having very close by an area of open space. That
But
would
we
be-
have the instruments in place to allow that. And that's why I'm looking at, we want to allow the maximum density on residential and, but the maximum intensity for non-residential uses would be on a portion of the property that's only zoned for commercial, right?
So in these cases, most likely this analysis would be done when a project is seeking a rezoning to a mixed-use plan development.
Right.
Or some of our other plan developments do allow a commercial component or a residential component when you're a CPD or an RPD, and not to confuse you with all these terms, so, or acronyms. So, there are some categories when you're dealing with a conventionally zoned property that might allow commercial and residential at the same time. But in most cases, we deal with this issue during our plan development rezoning processes. And in most cases, those projects are located in future land use categories that allow a maximum of 10 dwelling units an acre
Right.
and a maximum floor area ratio of 1.2. And what ultimately usually happens is you have the developers utilize 10 dwelling units per acre on the whole project to get their residential density. And they put it to one part of the project. And then the commercial, I mean, they don't maximize their commercial as much. I mean, most of the development around Bonita Springs is at a 0.3 FAR. I mean, it's because land's a lot cheaper, so there's no financial hamstring or incentive for them to go higher or build larger square footage projects. So most of our commercial is below a 0.3 floor area ratio. Whereas in your more urban cities, you'll get higher up because land's more expensive, so.
But as I see, ultimately, we're going to be developing the Bamboo Village area, and because of the cost of the dirt and everything, in my mind, these numbers are not going to be realistic.
And as part of the DPZ exercise, I believe they are looking at the Bamboo project, and if their recommendation does not meet the current comprehensive plan policy and the current density provisions, I'm sure they will let us know, and we will look to council for direction.
The mathematics of it, I don't think 20 units to the acre wouldn't even come close. And so I'm looking at this, somehow 15 units with a benefit of 5 bonus has kind of crept into this mindset down here that 20 units is somehow a magic number. But I look at Bamboo Village and I think to develop that profitably or to entice the developer to come in there, there's going to have to be substantially more density than 20 units to the acre. 20 units to the acre is not very dense when you get right down to it. And so I look at it and I think we're looking at the future here, and I don't want to have, or I don't think that the magic number of 20 units is really a magic number. It's just a number that we've been stuck on here for a while. And so I don't want it get to be built into the system, so to speak, that it's somehow.
I agree with you there.
And those are the current regulations that are in place right now, which this ordinance is not intending to change any of that. But that is something that you can keep apprised. Just know that DPZ is working on something for the downtown and Bamboo properties, one of those pieces that they're going to help the city with some recommendations on. So,
But if we
please
agree
monitor.
to pass this on to council with our blessing, how does it impact what they come up with in their study?
I see them as two separate and distinct processes. So depending on the recommendations that come out of DPZ for not only downtown, but also Bonita Beach Road corridor, if their recommendations come out that are different than what our comprehensive plan currently sets forth for maximum density and intensity, then part of their recommendations to city council would be whether it's an increase or decrease depending on the development pattern that is recommended, and then council will give direction, and we'll have to address it at that time.
Any more questions?
I guess my question is, does it make sense to hold this until we get the DPZ recommendations?
There are other corridors in the city that DPZ is not analyzing, so
Could there be an exclusion in our approval?
you definitely are a recommending body, so we can bring your thoughts to the city council for their consideration. I believe this is scheduled for September 5th.
Yes.
Well,
And
we-
we can, I can explain in the green, this is the nice part, is usually I have to hustle after your meeting to get the green sheet ready because it was scheduled for August 15th, but they moved it to September 5th. So I'm taking notes. I hope to properly characterize viewpoints. I won't have exact quotes from here. If you want to suggest applicability where this should not apply whatsoever, and it's not in our provision, does not apply, you know, like broaden this just downtown area or any other place, you know, let me know. Or Bamboo Village, if you want to take Bamboo Village out as a specific.
Yeah,
The other problem there is people get mad when it doesn't apply to city property, but it applies to everybody else.
it's a nice caution.
I don't have a problem with it because this is city property, the city purchased specifically because it's on the river and they could make it into some, you know, a catalyst
Sure.
into something.
Now, this is part of the quick fix.
Yes.
It's interesting. These are difficult topics here.
They are
because
very
they
difficult.
They deal with the future, and we're looking to quick fix the future. In other words, we want to find something to stop something until we get some time passed here. I don't know the reason for all of that.
You know, there might be, I mean, this is not a new problem. We've always had it where members of the zoning board want to be LPA members, members of the LPA want to be zoning board members. And there's kind of a functionality between the two boards that it might make sense for the boards to have a little more communication. Because
Yes.
I'm not sure the zoning folks get the fact that the, you know, and the zoning folks might have more of an ear with certain council members.
And the thing is, too,
That's the closest I've ever
that
said.
they are much more specific than we are, because the comp plan is very broad.
Well, and they're looking at very right, they're looking at very specific pieces of property. So they're looking at the jigsaw puzzle piece, and if it's not fitting correctly, they're trying to trim it. And you guys are looking at a more broader, this is the city, but you're playing 3D, I call it 3D chess, where you're looking at it not just today's rules, but how are we looking at it 70 years from now?
That's
90 years?
precisely my point, and has been all day today, is that we're looking at the future and how, and you read part of the comp plan here, and I think that you need to take a look at this more than once, and that's what I don't understand about quick fix. That bothers me a little bit, that we are not taking a broader look at this based on the vision of the city. And I think right now, the vision of the downtown area, not the whole city, just the downtown area, is in a quandary. Because some council members agree with the vision, some do not. Some agree with the rendering for the downtown area, others are not. And that has not been decided. There's not a cohesiveness in the council to say that we're going in one direction or the other. And here, we're asked to look into the future here and base our decisions on the comp plan, and they're asking for a quick fix. How long did it take you to put the comp plan together, Rex?
2 years.
2 years.
2 years. And that was tough, I'm sure.
And we still don't have the LDC. It was pretty good, I mean, which would be totally different than what we have on the books, so.
If I were to make a motion, I would motion that we isolate the downtown area or portions of it from this requirement here. Because the DPZ study is yet to come, and these people have been hired by the city based on very good recommendations, and they have a real nice resume. So I think they understand the issues, particularly of downtown, but of the whole city. I've seen some of their plans, and they've been successful in other places with it. However, I'm concerned about the downtown because I finally want to get people to come to downtown. I want them down there using the services that our business people offer, and I want to see new businesses come downtown. I want to see it vibrant and active.
Do
And-
you, let me ask another question, and that is, we have two other, we also have DPZ looking at Bonita Beach Road with the O'Toole, and we made some changes, of course, to the
Right.
comprehensive plan with the Tool study. Do you also want Bonita Beach Road area also to be not included in this?
I don't have as much trouble with that
Okay.
as I do downtown because of the desire for some intensity, and it could be vertical, it could be horizontal. But my proposal is based on growth and based on the comp plan.
I'd like to ask you both a professional question. Does this new language inhibit the flexibility needed in a changing market? Is it going to be much more difficult for
So some developers are going to say any regulation makes it much more difficult. You know, it's, what happens is they'll prepare a pro forma, and now they have to do another calculation or maneuver, and they feel that it fixates and creates a problem to their plan, and it does. So, I mean, in the sense that they have to comply with these regulations. I mean, if you feel that you want to have just one method of calculation, and remember, I started the discussion, you know, communities are shifting, so what we would use in the 20s versus 50s versus, so this is just a tool in the box so that there is a snapshot so people aren't trying to over-intensify.
That's a good question, Jeff.
And I think, and Audrey's correct, it depends on the developer and their pro forma, and an example would be, at the interchange, we have the southeast quadrant where a zoning action was filed and approved called Horizon Park. And they did not utilize a double dipping of density, but their development program was mostly commercial. They did want to have possibly a hotel or an assisted living facility. And when you do an assisted living facility, we have density equivalents. But they were able to go ahead and utilize everything without doing a double dip and proceed with their zoning as is. Whereas on the southwest quadrant, you had Bonita Exchange, which exercised the double dipping provision, if you will. And they took all of their density, which was about 264 units, put it in the back, and then exercised some of their floor area ratio to put development on 3 out parcels up front. So it just kind of depends on the developer.
An
But we have
interesting
both
question,
situations.
statement you just made there. You're talking about a hotel, and then you're saying if it's a long-term stay hotel, does that qualify for residential allotment?
So under our code, our supplemental regulations for hotels, we do have, and I don't know the exact terminology, but I'll call it a rental equivalency factor.
Okay.
When you're in a conventional district, there are standards of square footage, certain square footages equal a dwelling unit. So depending on the size of the hotel room, it equals so many units. But when you're a planned development, there's another standard in the code that says how you evaluate those, and they're not subject to density equivalency.
Wow. Because long-term hotels have just been a phenomenon in the past few years.
Yes, our regulations definitely have not caught up with the current trend
Yes.
of
That's an
hotel
interesting thought.
shares.
Right,
or-
yeah, and the
Hotel
argument is, well,
condos.
once you go into planned development, you're creating kind of almost a little community unto itself, so therefore, go at it, boys, you know, and create what it is. And I happen to live in a DRI community that did that. They calculated different things, and this area probably would have been the woods for like the longest time, and it's now an apartment complex, and perfectly fine, and nothing wrong with it, and I'm close, I can walk to places, I can walk to shop, I can walk to attractions, and I enjoy that. So that's, different people are gonna have different viewpoints, whether that's, I'm not giving a value judgment, whether it's
Yeah.
good or bad. I'm just, different people are gonna want different things, and then other people are gonna want more of a cookie cutter type residential, and where you, and she's heard me complain about, where you have food deserts because you have to drive, and if you can't drive, you're now a prisoner of the cul-de-sac.
Yeah, the hotel condo concept is an issue that multiple jurisdictions are handling, and I've had a conversation with one of the outside legal counsel attorneys on this, and he might have some insight on how to address that if the city council desires to look at that issue, because it is becoming a popular trend.
Does double dipping, does it affect the project that's more suburban than one that is more urban?
It depends on the development parameter.
Yeah.
Would it affect anybody that had mixed use, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Because like I said, with Horizon Park, they didn't need it. It wasn't something they
Yeah.
contemplated, but in exchange, they utilized it. So it depends on the development.
So this is really kind of addressing the mixed-use projects more so than anything else? Yeah. That's where you have the most difficulty, I think, because they're, as you say, unto themselves. You know, it's a sort of self-sustaining in a way. Anyone want to make a motion or forward something here, a thought about how you might consolidate and move on?
I can see two sides of this. I'm still contemplating. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I look at it as a downtown issue and a suburban issue. That's why I wanted to isolate the downtown area out of this for now, until we hear more from the planning group, DPZ.
Is there some way we could postpone this until there's the
You can
planning
make that
group?
recommendation. So, I mean, if city let me make sure I understand. So the original recommendation was postponing anything in the downtown area until DPZ has finalized the study. The new one would be postponing the entire ordinance until after DPC has completed, or?
It involves anybody that has mixed use, so it really doesn't make any difference whether it's in the downtown overlay or anyplace else. It applies to everyone that's in the mixed use program. So, and I think there's some issues that have been brought up that need to be clarified.
When did you say DPZ is going to have some information?
They were just hired to do the downtown like 2 months ago,
That
so
could be a
it's
long
going to be a
time.
while.
Yeah, that's why I look at the quick fix thing. We have people giving us information that's coming down the pike here that might help us make this decision based on what the comp plan is telling us about now and in the future. So I think it would help us if we're looking at the future to wait to see how that would impact that vision.
And what would, that's a good thought. My other thought would be, what could be the worst thing that could
You
happen?
need to speak loud enough so we can get
I'm
it on the
sorry.
record.
My other thought is, what could be the worst thing that could happen if we postponed it for a number of months or a certain period of time?
The concern would be more developers would have their foot in the door, making the argument that staff has to look at calculations, both intensity as well as density, so that the concern is the double dip. So,
Let me ask, based on that point, what's the likelihood that we have enough property downtown that a mixed use would come in, which requires a lot of property, that this would even happen?
We have done an analysis where we have acreages by sub-area, because right now in the downtown, you can only do mixed use in sub-area 6A and 6B.
Right.
So it's a limited area. I don't have the acreage in front of me. But again, the goal with downtown is so people don't have to come before any zoning action. We want
Right.
to make it as consistent and predictable as possible, so
Yeah.
they can.
That's why I want, if I were to vote here, I think it would be to hold the downtown area out, because we do have a lot of suburban area here that developers are looking at for all kinds of mixed use projects, flex projects and things like that. So property is being bought up and developed in that sense. My concern would be more for downtown than the outside areas, because of the probability of land being developed. So if there could be a proposal, a motion, I would say that we would adopt this and exclude 041 urban core. The overlay, right, because the overlay stops at Rosemary, I think, to the north. and there being properties that way, you have quite a bit of property up that way. So it would impact them. So it would be, the motion would cover only the redevelopment area, urban core area of downtown. But it could be, this could be passed and approved for the outlining areas, suburban areas.
So what I would do is it could be consistent with the comp plan, but modify 4-371E2 to include the urban core into the, as well as the Terry Street.
If I may, currently right now, because of the way the
Oh, it's already
comprehensive
in.
plan is written, 6A and 6B, those sub-areas are the only ones that allow for mixed-use development. All the other ones are more single-use, so you can only have commercial, or you can only have residential. So I think if the concern is what impact would this have on downtown, you're most concerned with sub-areas 6A and 6B.
So we could limit it to that, is that right?
So if we modified the language, Jackie, of E1, so just as properties located within the old US 41 redevelopment in accordance with this policy, would that be consistent with what they're asking?
With that policy, it's excluding the first floor only.
Right, so if you took out the first floor and you say it does not apply to properties located.
Do this,
Keep it
I
as a
would keep
separate?
it as it is, and maybe you can include and mixed, or sub-areas 6A and 6B.
So just add sub-areas 6A and 6B?
I've seen this map quite a bit, and I think that's appropriate to ask for those two areas. That's where it would really occur. There's a lot of single property, as yours is, Rex, along Old 41 Road, that unless you would spend years trying to get all those properties owners to give you enough area to do anything of a mixed use. So, okay.
Okay, so what we would do is we would have it as areas sub-A and sub-B as shown in LDC section 4-887, the exhibit of the old US 41 corridor redevelopment master plan. I mean, we'll clean that language up, but.
That's okay with me, because we've isolated this down to not hinder, what any kind of developer coming in with large tracts of land outside the redevelopment area. It would slow that down to where, that can be controlled a little bit. So I think that would be a good motion. Take a vote unless, is there any other discussion before we take a vote?
Sub-areas 6A and 6B.
Yeah.
Second on the motion.
Is anybody
Okay.
going to second the motion?
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay. Third. Okay, let's take a vote.
Meg Jacobson,
Yes.
Linda Schwartz,
Yes.
Rex Sims,
Yes.
Carolyn Gallagher,
Yes.
Jeff Maturo,
Yes.
Chairman Vincent.
Yes. Motion passes.
Okay, and the motion again is just to find the ordinance consistent with the addition of adding that it does not apply to sub-areas 6A and 6B of the old US 41 corridor redevelopment master plan as shown in LDC 4-887. Yeah, but
And I believe that it excludes any planned development approval before August 15th. So
Right.
we're not impacting any of that.
that date might be adjusted to the September 5th, but
Okay.
I don't know if it affects anybody at that point. The next one is probably the most controversial, which is section 4-28, neighborhood meetings. You have the ordinance here, and again, this comes from a couple different areas. We do sometimes have outreach-type meetings. The meetings are developer-driven, and it's done in other communities. Collier County, Naples, Estero all have a mandatory neighborhood meeting for certain things. This would set up a neighborhood meeting. There are some requirements in this ordinance that even the zoning board had some one member in particular had issues with. Because of the 1,000-foot was, I think, a major issue, and then he also wanted to use city facilities for these meetings.
And it was the number of meetings too. If I may, I'll just walk you through
Yeah.
the draft ordinance. And this was an opportunity to go ahead and encourage more neighborhood input into these applications, and to get the community involved prior to someone filing an application, so they felt like they were truly a part of the process. So the first section, 4-2AA, just essentially says what the intent of the ordinance section is. Applicability, this identifies what applications would be required to file, to follow this procedure. So it'd be any applications for a future land use map amendment, a rezoning application, or a special exception. And what would happen is that we as staff would not accept the application until a neighborhood meeting was held. So there's 2 meetings as part of any one of these applications being processed with the city. So the first meeting would occur prior to filing, and then the second meeting would occur once the application is found sufficient and before it goes to public hearings. So that's what B says is the applicability. And then C goes into the procedure. And with that, we went ahead and set forth guidance and regulations in terms of where the location of the meeting should be held, the time, the size of the facility. And we added in here, based on some of the feedback as it went through the process, where we could, there's some opportunities for a waiver request that the city manager or designee could evaluate. So 1 goes into the time and place of the meetings. 2 goes into the notification in terms of, for the notification, how it would have to be mailed out and an ad placed in the paper. With the mailed notices, the staff first recommended 500 feet. And then as it went through the process, there was input from, I can't remember if it was the zoning board or city council, that standard be increased to 1,000 feet. And that's where we got some public comment on the concern of having conflicting regulations or confusion. So for example, when we do a rezoning application, property owners are notified if they're within 375 feet. If there's an alcohol application, the standard is 500 feet. So there was concerns about having 1,000 feet versus 375, and there being some confusion and inconsistency with the distance criteria. So that came up during our public hearings on this item. So 2 goes into the notification. 3 goes into the conduct of the meetings, and that goes into how we would like the applicants to present their requests to the community. 4 goes into staff attendance. There was a lot of discussion on whether or not staff should be mandated to attend these meetings or not. And David Theriak had some input into that process, and that's why the language is written as it is. It's because you really don't want staff to be the negotiator, the referee, or at these meetings. So while we can be there and kind of be a fly on the wall just to observe, it's not mandatory that we attend. But a lot of our staff will most likely attend anyway. 5 is just the written summary of the neighborhood meeting, where the applicant is required to provide us a summary, to go ahead and let us know what occurred at the meeting, the issues that were raised, how they're going to address them. 6 is written summary of the post-sufficiency meeting, so again, going into a summary of what occurred at that second meeting. And then 7 is the response to the summary, how will the applicant incorporate changes to their plan or conditions to their plan so they address the neighborhood concerns. And that is the general intent of this section of the LDC.
Let
Could
me
I
ask,
have a comment?
okay, go ahead.
It's okay. When I read this, I thought, yay, this would prevent what happened with the homeless shelter, where we got only by accident news that they were going to build a 270-bed shelter on the property between the charter school and the art league, somewhere down toward the art league. And I thought, oh, well, this means that there would have to be some kind of notification so we would know that. And then reading it later, I thought, it's only for a future land use map amendment, rezoning, or special exception, and I don't think any of those were pertinent to that. But it certainly is something that was inconsistent with the neighborhoods, that, you know, a shelter of that size. And people were really, the majority of people were really upset about it. So I just wanted to say that about this, and I just wanted to get you to say this would or would not pertain to something like that happening again,
Yeah, if I
where it would
recall
be
the-
controversial.
If I recall the history of that, it was an older plan development that had a whole list of uses. And at the time, we categorized those as social services group 3. And as a result of that, we had the moratorium, and then we did code changes where we have land development code changes and then supplemental code of ordinance for the operating procedures. So, so you're correct. If it was just for, they were going to file a development order to get their site permitting.
They had already filed it by
Correct.
the
So
time the
this would
secret got
not-
out.
This was geared towards someone who was filing a future land use request or a rezoning request or a special exception request to get a use that wasn't already authorized
Or
under the current
permit.
regulations. So it wouldn't capture those properties that already have the land use in place, the zoning designation in place to pursue their local site permitting.
In the future, would there be a way to get out information when things are expected to be controversial like that?
Not under our current regulations. With community development, where we've taken some active steps, is we actually have a community project portal on our website where people can go to the website and see what's been filed.
That's true, but how many people
it's-
really do that?
Exactly.
Let me ask a question, I guess, along with your question. Is there a trigger in the size and use of a project for this to take place?
No, sir.
Should there be, I wonder? If I'm going to build a little grocery store somewhere, do I need to have the entire neighborhood approve that or have comment on that?
If you're going to sell beer there,
Well,
it might be significant.
Right, and that would be, somehow this can't apply to everybody, I guess.
It's only if you're filing for a land use change or
Land
a
use change.
zoning change or a special exception, where in those cases, it might be appropriate under certain circumstances, but you need a special exception to go ahead and
Well,
continue with processing that use.
When I first started looking, you know, at the stuff on the homeless shelter, the main point that I made over and over again, and everybody ignored me, was the vision of the comp plan where it said it should be in keeping, you know, with the current buildup of the area. And clearly in my mind, and I think ultimately in everybody's mind, it was not. Is it possible something like that could be added in here?
Well, that was refused, I believe. You know, we didn't approve that, and that was why the moratorium.
No, you did not
Yeah.
approve it. That, there was a big.
Yeah, a
you
lot
to
of people
do
here
over
for
it.
that sort of thing.
And I think ultimately the reason they didn't approve it was the vision. I'm not,
Well, we
but
had-
we do have a approval of of a shelter in Bonita, or more than one, of less than 30 or less beds.
We had the moratorium, and I don't recall the court case history on it, because there was a court case as well that was processed through the system. So I can't recall how the.
Mandamus?
For Glenwood.
Yeah, there was the mandamus case. So the mandamus just was thrown out on a procedural because they had turned in a application and they were denied, and they waited before, and they were saying, well, you had to have everything in effect, and we had this short window, so you should have processed it for
We
the
did something
effective date. And
They
we
didn't have
prevailed.
everything in there they needed, because there were things that I identified that weren't current or weren't there. But anyway, so, but the point is, I would like something that says, a way that things like that are controversial and clearly, or pretty clearly, against what the vision of the comp plan is, that they would be brought to attention. I'm not saying that they should necessarily be stopped, but people should know about it before it goes so far, because City Council had the development plans already and was looking at them.
I think there's value in that, but what I look at is once you do all this and you get down to lots of opinions, the one you want to look at is, well, how many people constitute the majority in this area within 1,000 feet? Does that mean that, and we're in season much of the time, half the time, and so these meetings have to be called in conjunction with seasons. And I wonder, as we've seen here many times on controversial issues, it goes pretty far before we get enough people. And because we fill this room with 60 or 70 people, does that represent the entire city? And so within 1,000 feet, how do you determine that we're getting a true response from the people within 1,000 feet?
I agree with that, too.
And that's the problem.
That is a problem.
Well, the other thing,
But-
let me also talk a little bit about what they talked about at the workshop, because first of all, when you do zoning, it's a little different than comprehensive planning. Instead of legislative deference, you need substantial competent evidence. And one of the things that the courts are very clear are not substantial competent evidence is like the polling, where you have the 100 group
Right.
come in to say yay or nay situation. That they might have factual information that does make it substantial competent evidence, but coming in to protest or to support in and of itself is not substantial competent evidence. The ability of having the neighborhood meetings and what was talked at the zoning board and having them early in the process allows the developer feedback so they can create something that's a better plan. And they're not stuck, again, we talked about pro forma, they're not stuck with their design and static, and I'm not moving because I spent all the money I'm gonna spend on this and I need my approvals. Instead, you have the fluidity of having a better project and having better compatibility because you have the public coming in earlier to be able to be supportive, or whether they're supportive or not, at least there's some parameters of the project, and if there is one little thing that could be modified to make the project compatible in the minds of the adjoining property, they can fix it.
How long will it take?
A neighborhood meeting?
Well, how long will it take to get a project approved based on this neighborhood meeting?
I can't tell you. I mean, obviously, they're supposed to have certain time frame of days. It can be done
Be notified.
overlapping.
But there's no provision written in here for, I want to build on a piece of property. I've got to get money from a bank. I got a certain amount of time to do that for that loan to sustain itself. Now, I've got something thrown in front of me here. I've got to go talk to, I don't know how many people within 1,000 feet of this property. And it's got to be done in 21 days. The month has already passed. So my project is being prolonged on and on and on until somehow we get a majority of people in this neighborhood to agree to allow me to do this. Is there a time frame on when they have to decide on when everyone agrees?
What this was geared towards capturing was, and in relationship to time, I think it's safe to presume that before you file, you're going to need at least a month and a half to go ahead and mail out the notices, provide the ad in the paper, orchestrate the meeting location, have your first meeting, prepare your summary to submit with your application. So I think a month and a half at the front end before you file would occur. And then once you're found sufficient, you'll have to do the same procedure again. So that will add another month and a half.
And let's
And then-
suppose that I hear about this, but I don't want this to be developed there. And so I keep saying, I just didn't get that notification. And I got a number of people who agree with me that they didn't get their notification. So what does that do to this process?
So the notification is placing the ad in the paper, so they would have to provide us, every time an ad's placed in the paper, when we do it, we receive a affidavit of publication
Yes.
from the newspaper. So they'll have to provide that to us. We'll know it was adequately noticed. For the mailed notices, what we could do is actually require that they send it certified mail, and then they can give us all the certified mail receipts. And that could take
Actually, they could post it out here in front on the bulletin board out here, and that qualifies as an advertising, does it not?
Well, under this draft ordinance, we are putting in the language that it go into the newspaper, so it would be a legal advertisement, and then they actually mail a listing that they get from the property appraiser.
Mr. Chairman, all this is interesting, but when we incorporated the city, we had a series of public meetings, and we were selling the charters, what we were selling. And it was kind of interesting because Hank Hostetler was my partner in these 5 meetings, and Hank was a deacon at the Presbyterian Church, so everybody else in town was against us and wouldn't let us meet any place. So we met at the first meeting to organize the city was held at the Presbyterian Church. The very next paper that came out was a huge letter to the editor in there about we were meeting in a church on a governmental issue, and there was a constitutional prohibition of that, and I was amazed.
Well, I have a huge question. It's kind of ambiguous. Who determines that any concerns have been addressed? You know, I'm a fire
Don't
commissioner,
understand.
so you deal with the public, and you always have people that chronically complain. It's the same people over and over. At one point, do they say we've addressed their issue? Because they just don't want it built, so they're constantly going to come up with an issue. That could go on forever.
That's my fear with things like this. And Rex, you're absolutely right that there's always something that comes up in public.
The thing that is, first off, and I think this is something that we may have overlooked, any place where this meeting is going to be held has to qualify for the handicap laws. So that means they have to have ramps and doors and potties and everything. And you'd be amazed the number of places that are relatively modern in Bonita Springs that do not comply with the handicap laws. And so we had a meeting out at Lightner Creek, and the after dark, and somebody fell over a parking barrier because there was not proper lighting and so forth. You've got to be extremely careful that if it's just going to be an advertised public meeting, it has to be held in a handicap accessible that qualifies. And so that's the first thing that you have to determine. And the second thing that I'm concerned about is really who's going to be in charge. Because once you hand the microphone to somebody, you're not in charge anymore.
And these
And
are,
the third thing is, we had here in this room, we had issues in the past where we had to have policemen here. And so if you're out in a neighborhood meeting someplace on a controversial thing, who is going to be responsible for the crowd control
Civility?
and the safety of the people there? The fourth thing is I noted is they have to have parking lots that have lighting on them because we had an issue with that. And then the next thing is that bothers me is you have to have time that this building is available, which may not be the time that you're advertising for, you know.
And out of
especially if you're
season.
meeting in a, we used to meet at the public building up next under the banyan tree before they tore it down because it was literally
Community.
the only place in town, and it didn't qualify for the handicap. So then the other thing that I'm really concerned about is actually the recording of the meeting. The beauty of having it in this room is everything that is said and presented by both sides is recorded. There is a record there. And when you have it out in the neighborhood, especially on a zoning meeting, which is almost a legal meeting, there's no provision, and the outcome of the meeting is written up by somebody that you don't have any control over. So
There's some variables
I know
here.
all of us have been to meetings where when we read the report of the meeting, I say, was that the meeting I attended?
Well, you
So
know,
there's a whole lot of issues here that, and while I think it's a good idea, there's a whole lot of issues that I think have not been addressed. And the principal one that you start out with is when you say it has to be in a handicapped accessible building, and there's a question in my mind of whether, believe it or not, of whether you could actually hold a zoning meeting at a church.
Well, you know, what I look at too is that the comp plan's written in such a way that we invite people to come here and build and live and so forth. And we keep coming up with some of these things that throw obstacles in the front of people who have just that desire. And that was one of the reasons I mentioned the size of the project or the use, where you would have this kind of public input. I believe that when properties are being developed, there's a sign that's placed on the property that talks about, the rezoning or the, not redevelopment, but rezoning. This would apply to rezoning, is that right?
This applies to future land use map amendments, which we also post, rezonings and special exceptions, and in all cases, we do require a posting of property, but it's 15 days before the hearing for zoning, and I think it might be 30 for small-scale comprehensive plan amendments, which is not all future land use map amendments, because it can be larger than what we call a small scale, which is under 10 acres. So the challenge with doing that, while we do notification, it's once the application's found sufficient and it's at the tail end of the process. And here we're trying to capture them at the beginning of the process.
And I think that's a good thing. That's important. However, what I'm concerned about is, I guess, the obstacle of forcing the meeting. I like the one before, and I think in our codes, we do have a requirement that and I've seen most developers come through and quarry the people in the neighborhood. That's not a requirement, I don't believe, at this point.
It's not. In some cases, we try as staff to encourage it. If we
Yes.
know it's going to be an application where the neighborhood might have some concerns, we definitely encourage it, but we can't require it right now.
I guess what I'd like to do with this is, I think the neighborhood, getting the neighborhood involved is important. However, I'd like to put some time frames on it, at least as a recommendation, that, this thing can't go on forever based on one comment or two comments. And even here, it talks about response to the summary. If you're in attendance, you can submit some additional information on the meeting and so forth. But there's no time frames tied to that. Can we do that, or would the board agree to that, that in this process, are we going to make this a 2-month process, a 3-month, or a 5-month process?
If I may, the way this is written and how I see it actually happening is the first meeting will be held prior to filing. So I think it could take a month to a month and a half to actually get through that process. The summary of that meeting is going to be submitted with the application. And the way we have it written under 7, the response to the summary, the applicant obviously has to submit the summary to staff. But any other participant at that meeting is welcome to also prepare a written summary and submit it for us to evaluate too. And then the second meeting is held once the application is found sufficient. And again, with that summary that discovers the issues or brings to our attention the issues, that's not going to hold up the scheduling per se. It might affect our recommendation of the project.
Right.
But it wouldn't necessarily add to too much to the timeline.
In the summary or response to the summary, can you put a time frame for anyone who was at that meeting? They've got 5 days to submit their additional comments. Because if you say as a staff, we didn't get any, and they said, well, you approved it too fast. I mean, you didn't give me time to submit a response. So you're saying if you don't respond in 5 days, staff is going to proceed with the second review of this project?
Well, the first
The scheduling.
thing that's a weak link in this process is that the report of the first meeting is going to be filed by the applicant. And I'm quite sure if I were the applicant, I would carefully prepare a report that would be very favorable. It was a wonderful meeting and ice cream was served by all and so forth. So I'm quite sure that would be of suspicion in my mind, the original report that came out. And then to a neighbor putting in writing an objection is asking a lot, I think, to put it down in writing, because I would be against some things, but I wouldn't necessarily want to write a letter to you and say, hey, this is bogus.
Well, in this meeting, how do we determine if the people attending this meeting are within 1,000 feet?
That's a good question. Can people who are outside 1,000 feet attend? And do they have input?
Yeah, I think they would.
Yeah, I mean, I live 4 miles away and I'm attending this meeting because I just don't want to see anything on Hickory Boulevard. But I don't live there, I don't pass there ever. But I don't like the idea. So, I've got an opinion about that, yeah. And so,
And what constitutes, I mean, I suppose the applicant can have an address and then say, well, these comments were from the outsiders, people beyond. But I mean, if there are people that live within Bonita Springs, and you're always, just like we always talk about NIMBYs, not in my backyard, there's also
Right.
the term nope, which is not on planet Earth.
Right.
And there are people that are that way. So,
well, it is. So, we're trying to control a lot of things, and what are we really trying to accomplish? I think there are a lot of good things in here, but there are very few controls of these different kinds of things. And once you start down this road of throwing these kinds of things up, it's not going to stop with this. There's going to be other kinds of nuances to stop development of any sort.
One of my-
I think the idea is good.
I do
To
too.
have
I
a
do too.
primary meeting and have a written report of it. But in my opinion, it should be done right here in this room in a controlled situation where you've got a recording of everything that goes on, and you're not depending on a report that the applicant writes up to determine the results of the meeting.
Right. When
I
you
think
step up
the
here,
idea is good. It should be right here in this room.
you see, in here, when you want to comment, you have to state your name and your address.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells whoever's deciding here where you live and if you really have an impact on this decision or not.
I agree.
Well, the
Because I
important
live on
thing-
this planet doesn't allow me to stop a development on somebody's in somebody's
Yeah, but
neighborhood.
one of the important things is that the people that are close by, even further than 1,000 feet, because that's easily walkable, they should all have notices somehow. Now, maybe they're not going to come to City Hall to look at it if they're not expecting anything. So somehow, the people that are most affected need to know about it so that they can come here. I agree, Rex has a great idea if the city council room was available, if they could make it available. But I think the more people, not just the people within 1,000 feet, everybody needs to know about some of these things. And then they can make a choice whether they want to attend or not. Maybe it doesn't bother them at all. And not all of these things that are up for changes are going to be things that people are going to complain about. A lot of people are saying, well, no big deal,
Well, let's suppose that I want to build something on Beach Road over here, and I want to build it at a time when almost 50% of the people are not here, but they won't be back for 4 or 5 months.
Well,
So what do I do about that?
Well, with the homeless shelter, people were really upset about that
Well,
because they weren't
That's what I
here.
mean. We don't have the
Um,
controls for that. So you will hold someone up for a certain amount of time before they can even apply.
Well, seasonality did come up at the zoning board level and then throughout the discussions. So it definitely did come up. It was not added into for the time and place, and I can't remember if David Theriak provided some feedback on that. But I do recall some of the comments
Right.
would be,
Well,
we
you-
are a
Well,
full-time city.
You can't ignore those people, though.
No, I mean, does it mean, though, if I want to build something, I have to wait till I do it in season?
No, that's not how the ordinance is written, where it has to be held in season. And again, you have the 2 meetings, which is,
I think from a practical
beneficial.
standpoint, that was what I was saying.
sure, I definitely understand. And then 2, the distance came up about is 1,000 feet enough, and we're hoping that, obviously neighbors do speak, and if there's anyone beyond that 1,000 feet, they also would be informed of the meeting through other means.
Well, if you put it in the papers and everything, that should help a great deal. I don't know
But
that
it's in a legal
everybody-
ad, in
yes,
little print.
Yeah,
that's what I was
people
going to
don't.
say. That's not something I normally read.
Yeah, how many
And-
people do read
And
that?
yes, the communicate, when we were going through this, and later too, one of the, after the shelter, maybe a year or so later, there were meetings held about what can the city do better and so on and so forth. And one of the things that that bothered me a lot was the communication to and from the city. Mostly from the city, because people are usually, if they have a problem, they'll get you on the phone or the email or something and let you know it. But people don't always know what's going on, and I feel like there's got to be a better way to get some of this information out. And I think, and I keep going back to the shelter because that's what I know, and that this would not even cover. But when something like that clearly can affect people's lives, and also, in my mind, is clearly not in keeping with the vision that's in the comp plan, those are the type of things that the notice ought to be gotten out. Addition with the shelter, it was kept a secret. And a person bought the land with the intention of donating it to St. Matthew's House. And I remember in city council one day, the mayor, Ben Nelson, told the guy from St. Matthew's House, "You've been lying to us. That's on camera somewhere," which they were. They said they had nothing to do with it, but they were planning to take that donation and build a shelter. And there was a development order. So
But specifically, is this the way to do that?
I don't know, and that's what I'm getting to. That's a really good question. Could this be used, or could there be something
So
on
we'll-
here, something that could be perceived as controversial?
Sure. Let Audrey and I talk to David Theriak on this topic. You know, how do we handle properties where they have zoning entitlements for uses where we would have compatibility concerns? You know, is there a mechanism that we can build in to this ordinance?
I mean, certainly, in this case, you can link it to the comp plan, the vision
Sure.
statement. I mean, if you were going to have a fish cannery right in the middle of a housing area, I mean, you probably
Right,
wouldn't
there
have
just
it,
might be
but
some legal
there-
items that we would have
So-
to discuss when situations like that happen, when you have a zoning entitlement.
In my opinion here, I don't think there's enough in here to assure me that this is just not a roadblock. I like the idea, but
like
the
the
way it's
idea,
being
too.
done, there are too many questions being asked about that.
And if I
So-
could give you a little more feedback too, so David Theriak has been exposed to a multitude of jurisdictions up in the Panhandle where they have this process, you know, the two meetings. I can get more information from Collier County on how they handle theirs.
And
But
how it
I do know
actually
Collier
works.
County has the meetings at, you know, the applicant has to secure the location. Some conversations did come up about using city facilities here, and the concern with that, with prior councils, was would then the city be associated with supporting the developer if they're hosting that meeting? And then, obviously, some of the resources that would need to be allocated to keep the city hall open, have it adequately staffed, running the cameras and things like that. So there's resources that come in,
Would we
Would the
be
library
doing
be
that
set-
anyway
set up?
when we hold a normal meeting?
but it's usually during, the zoning board meetings are during business hours, you know. and-
Well, you could do these in business hours. I mean, if I live within 1,000 feet of this and I oppose it, I would want to be there.
You could, I think the intent was to have it after hours so people
Could
could
get
come
off
after
from work.
Yeah.
I
What
think
about the
that-
public library? Is that something you could get a kind of
could
an
rent.
agreement on being able to use it, and then another agreement specifically on specific ones for times and dates?
It depends on the facility. I know the one off of Pine Street, their public meeting spaces aren't as generous.
I know.
I don't recall
What about the
the
new
new
one?
library. Yeah, I don't recall the new library, but obviously I think they would have facilities for rent, but I don't know what the occupancy load is. And then again, it's, does the city enter into some interlocal agreement or contract versus the applicant? I mean, the intent of this was to put the sole
Well,
responsibility on the applicant.
I was thinking the library because the applicant certainly could enter in the contract rather than the city,
Right,
or the city, but the applicant could do that. But I do feel, on the other hand, that if it's held in the library, the city must send a rep, not necessarily a speaking rep, but somebody to be in the audience and have the contractor
link-
hold the meeting.
Yeah, the weak link of the thing is the person writing up the report is going to be the applicant, and that just shrieks to me that that's a no-no.
Yeah, I agree with Rex on that.
I don't know exactly how you get around that, but I
Well,
think
I-
it should be conducted by somebody from
Neutral.
the city,
Right, the-
or somebody with some
Right,
responsibility.
and the concerns with that are outlined actually in subsection 4 of the draft ordinance, is because in David's experience, what he was concerned about is they don't want the staff to be the ones that are serving as the facilitator or the negotiations.
Okay.
They really want them to be there to observe and to go ahead and be a quality control person when that report comes in. And I can tell you, I've done that personally myself with a case that's ongoing and on hold, where I attended the public information meeting, but I sat in the back of the room, I took all my notes, and when their report came back in, I definitely cross-referenced to make sure that they addressed everything. And those items they didn't address, I let them know in my sufficiency
You mean
letter.
they wrote a report and they didn't address all of the issues?
Correct. There
That's
may be some-
exactly what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to suggest we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's do our homework. Let's find out exactly what Collier's doing. Not that they may be doing it correctly, but let's see, because it seems to be working. Let's get some more details of what they did in the Panhandle, and then we can go from there. It sounds like we just need a little more.
Yeah.
Okay, let me say one thing here. What is the link here for this specific thing with the comp plan?
I think some of the issues that would come up during a rezoning or a land use application or special exception would be compatibility. And compatibility is very important in your comprehensive plan. And then two, you want to have public involvement. We actually have an element in our comprehensive plan for public participation. Granted, it's more geared towards comprehensive plan amendments and
Right.
evaluation and appraisal processes, but public participation is an important piece.
Yeah. Well, I was looking for that link because that's what the only thing we can really comment on is compatibility. And in here, there's specific things of how we get the compatibility. One of those concepts is neighborhood meetings. So does someone want to make a motion
To
or more
add-
questions?
To add that. Well, I want to just say something about Rex's comment. And
yeah,
Lynn
that I'd like to
agreed
say
about-
something as well.
Okay.
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 Should I go then?
Yeah.
Okay, is that there is a good chance that the person writing it up from the developer could misrepresent things. On the other hand, I think that people who really have problems with it, with the ideas that the developer is giving out, you're going to hear from them. So not necessarily maybe with a written report within 5 days, but I bet your email and your phone are going to be buzzing. So I think it's not going to get swept under the rug that there was a problem.
I think
So-
that these meetings should be recorded and transcribed.
So the best idea turns out if it's possible to use here, because all of that is available.
Does that mean
But-
like
Separate
the,
transcript.
when they have a zoning meeting and they have a legal secretary there taking it down?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the details,
That's pretty
but
expensive.
I know, but I think people should be able to identify themselves and then speak
Yes.
and have a transcription of the meeting.
Yeah, that's a good
You
one.
know,
Whenever
it-
you do court reporters, just to point this out, it runs about $4 or $5 a page. So just to have the court reporter presence, about, I think, $75 an hour? And then,
Okay.
and then per page, and I don't know if you've ever seen, it runs about $5 a page. So if you thought cost recovery was an expensive, and you don't even know about cost recovery, but we have a cost recovery system for applicants for specialized counsel. So if you think that's expensive, adding a court reporter in the mix can be very costly.
My comment here would be, I like Jeff's suggestion here because we're all exposed to the turnout that we get for different issues that we have here. And you can't say that a few people sitting out here represent the city for the betterment of the city. They have some ideas, but they may not be impacted by it. If you're within 1,000 feet, you would need to know that that person coming is within 1,000 feet. So hearing more about how other communities have handled these specific issues that come up with a concept like this is important to me.
So maybe we should just table this for a little while Jackie comes up with some more information for us.
Jeff, you want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion that we do just that. We table it till we hear from her and she lets us know how they're doing it. And it could address a lot of our concerns.
Okay.
Address the
Now, your
compatibility with
recommendation
comp
is to
plan.
table, but also realize council could go forward with it on September 5th.
Do what now?
The council could still go forward with it.
Our recommendation is to table it.
Table it.
We can't stop them from
Correct.
doing what they want to do.
And will you look about things that could be very controversial that could conflict with a comp plan?
Yes.
Okay, do I get a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion, a second. Any more comment on that? Take a vote, please.
Meg Jacobson,
Yes.
Linda Schwartz,
Yes.
Rex Sims,
Yes,
Carolyn Gallagher,
Yes.
Jeff Maturo,
Yes.
Chairman Vincent.
Yes. Motion passes. Okay, I believe that,
I make a motion, we approve the minutes as presented.
yes, and next meeting is Thursday, September 13th?
If we have anything for the
Right.
meeting, if not, it was a pleasure to work with you.
Now, let me ask, since you're not going to be at these, how legally, how are we represented here to?
Well, David Theriak provides our land use, so I would imagine either he or if the contract, however they negotiate the contract, if they go that way. They have not, council does not know exactly what they're doing yet. They have done the performance of an exercise of outsourcing. They are hearing recommendations to select a firm August 15th. They may select a firm. Alternatively, they may advertise to find somebody, at which point, if they do the advertising, I would believe they would use my assistant city attorney, and you've met her before. Her name is Carly Sanseverino, and I believe she's been to some of these meetings, and she's familiar with some of the issues.
So if it's none of those, but it's an outside counsel, what we're going to be getting then is a length transaction, is that right?
Well, that's what,
You know what I mean by that is that your opinions is because you live here, you've been here for a long, long, long time, you've done a lot of things, you hold a lot of information. When I talk to someone who does it on a purely independent level, professional independent level, I get a length transaction.
if you have an attorney who's first of all, before I came here for at least 10 years, I worked at Lee County government where the Lee County's local planning agency was one of my responsibilities for a period of time. So some of my opinions isn't because I live here, but because I have been professionally trained to deal with local planning agencies. So sometimes if you heard me call short-term, long-term planning, it's because that's what Lee County called it in, I think, the 60s or 70s. It was before my time, but they called it that a long, long time ago, and that it stuck with me. And some of the things I've learned over time, you're going to have somebody experienced who has learned different things, and they'll come in with those opinions, you know, and remember, you are statutory, so they'll come in explaining the statute to you and their read of the comp plan.
Well, you know,
Hoping I'm not giving you just personal opinions.
no, you're not, and I think that what I look at is if I want to read the law statutorily, then I can read it myself. Whether or not I understand it is another question, and how I apply it is another question. So when I get an answer from someone who reads or tells me what's in the book, that is not the same thing as when I get a dose of reality in that.
Well, I'm going to try, I think any attorney that's up here is going to try to give you an analysis based on the information that that attorney happens to know. Now, in this particular matter, I can talk about, well, prior councils or even prior LPAs, except for Mr. Sims, who's been on the LPA since its inception. You know, I can sometimes remember Larry Warner, when you were talking mixed-use developments today, I could hear Larry Warner in my head, Jim LaRue in my head. Jim, of course, was your staff person. And I think it's more important as to your staff person in continuity than the actual lawyer, because at the end of the day, it's whatever is legal, we let you know. I mean, I may have strong opinions on planning. I took planning in undergrad. I took land use courses in law school. I've always enjoyed the subject matter, but you can have somebody who's in private practice see it from different jurisdictions where I might know it anecdotally, but I only know it in practice at this location.
Okay.
All right.
One of the things that I see is happening that we're talking about right now, just take a second. Back in the beginning, we were under the jurisdiction, so to speak, and guidance of the city manager's office. And we had the assistant city manager here every day, and we were a part of writing the zoning ordinances and so forth that were necessary at that time. And we were the name of the thing is the Planning Commission, but we were actually planning back then. We were actually part of the planning process.
Yes, you
We were.
you wrote the ordinance.
And
that was
so
approved.
I felt back then that our connection with the city manager, we were contributing something to the city every time we met, and hopefully we did. But down through the years, I have seen that we're less and less. Essentially, now our function is to, does it comply with the comp plan or not? And we don't really have any role in any planning of any serious nature. I'm not sure of all the things we do here, how much anybody pays attention to it, but I feel like that there's a lot of talent here that is probably not recognized by the city, and that that's an error. There's in all the volunteer committees
That echoes what
in
Sam said
the
last
city.
meeting. He's
Yeah.
talked about that.
in all the committees of the city, there's a lot of talent there, and I'm not sure that it's being really used well. So I felt that back in the beginning when we started out, and we were working directly with the city manager's office. The city manager officer was in control of the LPA, and hiring Audrey was the best thing the city did, because we were transposing from Lee County, what do they call it, out in the country, zoning that Lee County had, into a city. And
rural.
when we wrote
Yeah,
the
the
comp
rural
plan,
lands.
yeah,
and the
when we wrote
fringe
the comp
before that.
plan, we wrote it with a couple of 10-year spaces in it, with the idea that by this time we would be 50,000, by this time we would be 70,000, by this time we'll be 100,000. And so there was a reason for all these things that we did. Now that we're 50,000 or more, it looks like that it just happened, but it really didn't. You were instrumental in getting it to happen in my mind. And so I'm disturbed by the fact that the LPA their influence is being, help me, what do I want to say? It's being restricted. And so I think that as far as I'm concerned, my term expires at the end of this year, and I'm not going to renew on the board anymore. So I think that we need to take a relook at the function of the LPA. I really do. But that's for somebody else.
And I do want to convey, we do have a new city manager. I'll convey your thoughts to the city manager along with Ms. Genson, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, you know that not everything, almost nothing, is cut and dried. And so when you're on a board like this and you're trying to make decisions on things that are relevant to the comp plan, which is a very big document, you look for the insight and the experience of people like Jackie and community development to help you out through these things. And of course, with you, and you've done a terrific job for us in helping us through those times of how do you make those tough decisions. And everything you decide relates to something else. You have a reference. With someone new, and that's why I mentioned arm's length transactions, because in that operation there's no reference. There's only a law as a reference. And the law is the law, but there is another side to the law. It's based on common sense. And it's based on how people act and how people do things. It's based on society, and society makes laws.
And you're correct. And I'd like to have confidence that whoever and however they're replacing the city attorney position, because one day I was going to have to leave. I mean,
Right.
you know.
But not in our lifetime.
That there's confidence that the person is competent, the person has compassion, and the person looks at balance and takes direction well. I mean, that's what you want. And hopefully, you know, if that doesn't happen, I'm sure city council will let the person know or replace the person.
Okay. Any other comments? Thank you very much for the
Yeah, we'll
job
miss you.
that you've done, and we will miss you.
Thank you.
Next, let's see, the approval of the minutes. Do we,
Approve the minutes as presented.
second?
I'll second that.
Okay. A vote?
Meg Jacobson,
Yes.
Linda Schwartz.
Yes.
Rex Sims.
Yes.
Carolyn Gallagher,
Yes.
Jeff Maturo.
Yes.
Chairman Vincent.
Yes. Meeting is adjourned.